Hello and welcome to vmtrooper.com, the chronicles of my journey to the cloud. Today I'll be talking about the subject of IP pools and the relationship that they have to virtual appliances, or vApps for short. Now, if you've never worked with a vApp that depends on an IP pool, the name IP pool may be a bit confusing. It's not just a matter of assigning a group of IP addresses that are available to the vApp. That's definitely part of it. But a broader definition of what IP pools do includes things like defining all the network properties, including the subnet that the vApp will belong to, the DNS server, the domain name, and other items that it may be a bit tedious for the average user to define in the vApp once it's deployed. This may be because most vApps tend to be, or maybe all vApps tend to be based on Linux due to Microsoft's licensing restrictions. It's not practical for many software vendors to distribute vApps based on Windows. So most vApps tend to be based on Linux. So if you're going to be using a vApp from a software publisher that depends on IP pools, it's a good idea to know how they work and how to set them up. The vApp that I'll be working with today is the vSphere Management Assistant, also known as VMA or VMA for short. And if you were not aware of the IP pool dependency, or maybe you didn't understand it, you may have decided to skip that step or ignore the warnings during the VM deployment. However, when you go to power on the VM, you may see something like what I'm about to show you right now. Okay, so we get this lovely error message saying that the network port group that I have assigned to my vApp, external, doesn't have an associated IP pool configuration. Now, do I need to start over from scratch and redeploy the VMA again with a port group that is associated with an IP pool? Definitely not. But I'll go through some extra steps just to show you first how the IP pool is set up, and then when you deploy a vApp, where you would define what IP pool it belongs to. So I'll go ahead and close this out, and we'll come back to this instance of the VMA and try to fix it later. Okay, so to define your IP pool, we need to go to the data center level object, and in my example it's vMtrooper HQ, and then switch to the IP pools tab. You'll notice that I already have an IP pool defined previously for another vApp that I've deployed, and that will be vCenter Operations Manager, but we can talk about that a little bit later. So to create my IP pool, I will click the add link. I'll give it a name. The name doesn't matter. It does not have to match the name of the port group that you'll be associating with the IP pool. And then the first two tabs relate to what the IP addressing scheme will be. So for IPv4, define the subnet that you'll be using. And you'll notice here that there's no subnet mask entry below the subnet, and that's because it's utilizing slash notation. So once I move over to the subnet mask definition box over here, this allows you to see that the corresponding net mask that is the 24 value corresponds to 255.255.255.0. If you change this value here, let's make it bigger. The net mask will change, and since you have a bigger net mask, that means you'll have less IP addresses available for assignment to your vApp. I have a standard Class C network, and if you need to understand what I mean by saying that, Just look it up in the CCNA materials, the Cisco Certified Network Administrator. It's one of the basics of networking that can help you guide you to understanding how subnets and subnet masks work. So I'm going back to my standard Class C network, and it'll show me what available addresses I can give to my VM. Okay, now if you have machines in this subnet already, it won't necessarily detect which IP addresses are already assigned, but it'll allow you to know what is the acceptable range of values that you can assign. So I'll go ahead and put in my gateway, which is the layer 3 router that allows your subnet hosts to talk to other networks. On my network, it ends with .254. For those of you who may not be networking savvy, you may have seen that most of the times people have their gateway defined as .1, especially on your home router, but you don't have to have your router address end in .1. It can be anything in the range. Just make sure you know what it is so that you don't have a problem assigning it to other hosts. Okay, and then you have this enable IP pool functionality. So this is where you would select the option to provide a list of addresses that will be available to your vApp. And this is why the name, the IP pool, can be a little misleading. I mean, the IP pool is just more than the assigning of a range of addresses. It's also the entire network definition. So in my mind, I would name this something like vApp network definition instead of IP pools, because that's a more meaningful label for what this does. But you know, sometimes when marketing and engineering gets together, sometimes they can't agree on a name and one group wins out. So I don't know which group won in this case, but it'd be nice if going forward they made the name a little less confusing. Okay, so I'm done with my IPv4 settings. Because I'm not going to assign a range of addresses, I'm going to assign one static address to my VMA VM. I don't have any IPv6 networking on my lab network, but if I did, this is where I can specify the values that correspond to how the hosts would communicate on an IPv6 network. DHCP, if you have a DHCP server on the network, you would go ahead and enable those options for IPv4 as well as IPv6. And then on the DNS tab, you would specify your domain name. As well as any any DNS servers on your network. If you need an HTTP proxy for your VM to browse the internet, this is an opportunity to define that here. The address as well as the port number, as they show you in this example. And then finally, don't skip this step. This is actually the most critical part of defining your IP pool. You have to select which VMware networking port groups need to be assigned or associated with this IP pool. So I'm going to be creating this IP pool for regular VM traffic. So I'll be assigning all the port groups that would be accommodating that VLAN, which is VLAN 124 on my network. So I have DV VM traffic, external, which is what my VMA is using, and VM network. And if you're paying attention to the naming of these port groups, you'll see that I do have the standard vSwitch on some of my hosts. I also have the VMware distributed virtual switch, as well as the Cisco Nexus 1000V in my environment. So I'll go ahead and click OK. Now you'll notice that the networks that I associated again are external VM_network and DV VM traffic. Now if you remember, external is assigned to my VMA VM. So if I was to start it up again, and I'll do it just so you can see, I won't get that error a second time. Alright, so my VM starts up just fine, no errors now, because I have my IP pool definition associated with my VMware port group. So let's take a look at how you would associate the IP pool when you're deploying your vApp. So I'm going to deploy the OVF template for VMA. I'm not going to complete the whole process because it's already deployed, but I'll go ahead and go through some of the preliminary steps just to show you where you get to that part in the definition. Okay, click next, accept the agreement, next. Can't give it the same name since I already have a VM with that name defined. I'll select my management cluster. I'll also select my storage. I'll thin provision my storage. You have to check with your software publisher what kind of storage your vApp supports, whether it's thick provisioning or thin provisioning. Since this is a VM that I'm really not going to save, I'll go ahead with the thin provisioning and click next. Now you'll notice this warning, and you may have seen it when you deployed your own vApp. Warning because the OVF template is using networking properties, it needs to have an IP pool associated with whatever VMware port group that you're going to assign to the vApp. Okay? Not all of your vApps that you deploy may have this dependency. For example, the Nexus 1000V, when you deploy it, it does not depend on VMware IP pools. You just define all of your network settings as you're deploying the VM, and it takes it right away. But other virtual appliances, like the vSphere Management Assistant, depend on the IP pool definition so that the user doesn't have to do too much configuration as they're going through the deployment process. Now, if I change this port group to a port group that has an IP pool associated with it, for example, management, the warning disappears because management does have an IP pool associated with it. So, and this is the network mapping section. So I'll go ahead and click next. IP address allocation. Fixed means that the IP address that you assign to the vApp stays with the vApp and doesn't change, even if the VM is powered down. And also you have to statically define the IP address. Transient means that it'll take one of the IP addresses that you assign to the IP pool. For example, that range section that we saw in the IP pool definition before. If you select transient, it will take an IP address from that range of IP addresses and assign it to the VM every time it powers on. And when you power off, that IP address will be reclaimed and available to another VM within your vApp. That's another thing you need to be aware of. Some virtual appliances have multiple VMs that are part of them that interact with each other to define or deliver what service the customer needs. For example, vCenter Operations Manager, it has an analysis VM and it has a UI VM. So the UI VM feeds off of the data that the analytics VM is collecting from your environment. So that's just one example of a vApp that has multiple VMs within it. And then DHCP, if you have a DHCP server on your network, you would select that option and it will look out for whatever DHCP values can be assigned to the VMs in your vApp. So at this point, we're going to assign the IP address that will be given to the VM that I'm about to deploy. And you need to make sure that it just follows the same network definition, belongs to the same subnet that your IP pool defined. Now let's say I put the wrong subnet number in there. Let's see what happens. Okay, so I get a warning that it's not within the right subnet. So let's say that you forgot, or maybe you selected the wrong port group. It'll let you know that you're assigning an IP address that's not within the acceptable range. So I'll go back and change it. And we'll see here that I'm in the 122 subnet. So now the definition is happy and we can proceed with the deployment of the VM. And then on the next screen, you get a chance to review all the settings that you're about to assign to this virtual appliance. And if I was going to deploy it, I'd click Finish. Instead, I'll click Cancel. Okay, so that's it for the demonstration of IP pool functionality. In summary, just remember that IP pools are not just a group of IPs that will be assigned to a vApp. They're much more than that. They'll allow you to assign your DNS servers, your domain names, and other settings that you would have to assign by hand. Now, if you're very skilled at Linux, that might not seem like a big deal to you, but there are some VMware administrators out there who live in a pure Windows world, and for their benefit, the IP pool can help with getting the network settings into the vApp quickly. Also, if you're going to be delivering or deploying a bunch of vApps, even if you're good at scripting and automation and things like that, why would you want to account for setting up the same network settings in every VM that you're about to deploy when you can just have VMware do it for you automatically? So if your vApps depend on IP pools, it's definitely a benefit for you to become familiar with this functionality and become adept at it. Thank you for joining me for this demonstration, and I look forward to your feedback at vmtrooper.com. Thank you, and have a good day.